Okay, so hello, Denise. Lovely for you to join me here today. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. We're going to talk about Agile in HR, and I think some more specifics around that would be about how we can more effectively do Agile transformations, because it's rather of the time over here in this country where everyone, every man and his dog, as we say, is doing Agile transformation, although some are doing it better than others. And there are some things that I think that we've had conversations about in the past that many people could do with hearing, and some things that I've written about in the book that that will come out as part of this conversation. So it'd be great if you and I have a chat for the next 30 minutes or so, and then open up to some questions I might have, or some questions that the audience might have, and we can go from there. So how about you introduce yourself, Denise? And
I will. First, thank you so much, Mark, for this opportunity. I really have always enjoyed our conversation. So I'm very excited to be able to share some of my experiences and insights with the community. So I would consider myself an HR practitioner and catalyst with extensive experience in integrating HR functions, disciplines and behavioral competencies in transformation that respect human dignity and achieve business outcomes. Just to give a little bit of a background in terms of my fuller background, I started in corporate human resources many years ago, over 20 years ago, and started in the recruitment. At that time, it was called recruitment talent acquisition now. And then as the company was growing, I moved over into really helping build and set the foundational HR functions. As the company continued to grow and I continued to grow, I really helped move from a tactical approach from within HR to a more strategic approach within HR, and then really became the director of corporate human resources, and from there really moved into director of organizational design and transformation. Most recently, what I've been doing is really helping organizations reshape their approach from traditional HR mindset and practices to one that really embraces today's business needs to become and remain agile. So that's kind of a little bit about my background and what I do. I would say that how I really kind of got into HR, into transformation and agile is really at the company that I was with. The CIO was really struggling and said, we need to change things. And he had really started going through a transformation. I was very fortunate that over the course of those years, I built a lot of relationships and partnerships and trust within my community. So he pulled me in to really kind of help him. But I do want to just kind of go back for a minute and talk about HR. I think that what's facing HR today is there's a dual role within HR. One is, how is HR itself changing it internally itself? HR is a very siloed, as many other departments and segments are, but I think really HR is very siloed and segmented. You have your benefits, and you have your talent acquisition, and you have your employee relations, and you have your compliance, and you have your payroll, and you have your training and development. And you can no longer be that siloed and segmented. They all merge and are interconnected. So for example, if you have a benefits department and their main responsibility is to set benefits, and they never talk to recruiting and understand what's happening from a talent acquisition and what we need in order to attract and retain people, it's a huge misconnect, and consequently you're not going to get great people to work for you. So I think from that perspective, HR needs to change. It needs to change its mindset. It needs to change its practices. The other role of HR, from my perspective, is really being able to support and foster an environment, support the transformation, and foster an environment that can change that mindset and behaviors. So, what do you want? Do you want a culture that's open and honest and experimental? Well, HR, is really kind of the steward of culture, and setting those norms and behaviors. So
Yeah,
I think that's really important.
see, I like that way of thinking, because the certainly in the UK, the HR gets a really rough time. One, because it's called HR, human resources. Don't like the term, but anyway, that's another thing aside. They get a really tough time because they've turned into these almost robots, these automatons. Because way back in the 80s, HR had more of this reputation about being very touchy-feely, pink and fluffy. This thing about helping people and supporting people, which is now gone. Largely, I can't say that in all organisations. But instead now they tend to be the ones who are the guardians of the process and each individual processes. So
yes,
I like this
so
idea.
I think yes, and I think HR. To your point, I think in the past it's been very rules regulated. We used to say, the principal, right? You're being called down to the principal's office, right? So you did something wrong. That's the only time HR really got involved in things, quite honestly. So changing and shifting that completely, and really having a seat at the table, and being a true partner and advisor is I think really critical. I think HR also has a unique perspective in terms of, HR should know how, if you have a strong HR department or practitioner, they are uniquely connected to the whole organization, and should be, and have a whole holistic approach about what is happening within the organization. Whether it's through exit interviews, stay interviews, employee engagement surveys, talent acquisition. What's the reputation out there? People tell you, recruiters might say, you have this kind of X, and it's very difficult for us to even talk about someone coming into your environment. So they really should have a pulse on the workplace. Now, whether they have the courage to address what might be unfolded and what has come to the surface is a whole other matter. But HR, again, if they're really strong HR practitioners, would be able to tell anyone at the C-suite level what is the real culture and morale of that company.
Yeah, see, that's absolutely spot on. And again, love what you said there about the whole stewards of the culture. In my book, I talk about, I've given a term, the Chief Culture Change Officer. It's triple CO. I was actually going to put a P in there somehow and get C3PO. And then that would show my geekiness for Star Wars and all that. But I'm not going into that today. But the C3O, if you like, that is the HR director. That is the person who ought to be bringing this all together. And hence, it was interesting when I heard you say earlier that it was the CIO who actually had a chat with you. And I'm assuming you're meaning that that's the Chief Information Officer, or is it?
Correct.
Yeah, great. Because again, I think there's chief investment officers and all these.
Chief Information Officer. So yes. So
that's the IT, if you like. Yeah.
In the IT department. Yeah. So so that was really kind of how I started. I will have to say, before he really pulled me in, he brought in consultants, and we had several consultants that were there. That ultimately, again, going back, if you have a strong HR department and people feel uncomfortable, I had so many people coming into my office with employee relations issues regarding the consultants that I had to go to him and say, what is going on? What are you doing? And then he had talked about, we're changing. This is the reason why we need to change how we're doing things. And fine, but that's all fine, well and good. But the people that we have that are trying to help us and help you are creating more toxicity and noise, and it's and being more negative. So now you're trying to change something, and people are viewing it in such a negative light that it has the reverse effect. So what we ended up doing was exiting those consultants, and we brought in other consultants, and we really did the same thing as we would do with any other associate. And I know you might call them employees, I call them associates, but just so that everyone understands when I say associate what that means, and really kind of talked with the consultants and coaches and say, this is we need someone who is going to be able to work with us and not kind of dictate what we need to implement. That doesn't work for us. We need to be, hey, this is not working, let's try this. We're getting noise from other business segments, let's try this. And really work with us to come up with kind of almost our own, if you will, agile way of working. Get rid of the nomenclature and the terminology. What you call something doesn't really, who cares, quite honestly. So that was really important. And then what we found is we took those coaches that were really kind of got us, and they helped to, so the people that we kind of sought out that were really excited about the transformation and wanted to be champions of that transformation, we kind of said, hey, would you want to be coaches? And they understood that it was a dual role in the beginning, that they still needed to do their other work, but also be this champion, and then ultimately became what we had called kind of like the leadership of the transformation. So I think that's really important too.
So can I ask you a few questions? Because there's some
Sure.
very important points you've touched on here.
Sure.
So, consultants, yeah. Now,
Mm-hmm.
and that's an interesting expression, isn't it? Because I'm a consultant, and I'd be sort of kind of worried, if you like. I'm going into an organization, and I always find that there's this edge with other consultants, and consultants from other organizations aren't very good collaborators, I find. I mean, they don't want to really collaborate or work with anyone, but they always want to tell you what it is that they think is the best solution, when they actually don't really understand or know the organization. So hence, my fourth mistake that I talk about in the book is the mindset of the helpers. I call them helpers in general, coaches and consultants, people who are coming in to do this. So which brings me around to another question for you, is what do you mean by coach? Because again, that's a bit of a misused term over here.
So I think when we talked about the coaches, it was really helping people to understand the change that we were going through, what the new practices were going to be. So, what is the planning and the sprint planning, and how do you organize the work? Really just understanding from that perspective what we're doing, what's a retrospective, what are we doing stand up, how are we doing that, right? What's the so helping them if they get used in the process itself. Like, so how do I go do something if I'm using Scrum? What's the best way of doing that? So I think it was more of that. They also would coach, and again, this is, I think, really important when you're talking about the coaches and the connectivity to HR, because those coaches would coach someone on their performance, and that's a slippery slope, because HR has to be included in that, or at least know about that. So that's when I say coach, that's really it is. It's coaching about the process, about the practices, as well as giving advice about a person's performance.
So if you mentioned a minute ago about nomenclature, And again, I think that's extremely important. I was in an interview some days ago by an organization, an investment bank, and they wanted to avoid using the word agile. And we had a little chat about that. And yeah, I'm quite a fan of surfacing the language just so that we understand what we're talking about. So for me, avoiding language, yeah, it doesn't solve a problem. Actually, what we need to do is understand the language, and then if we need to change it. So if I can put some terms, yeah, around what you've just mentioned there, because I see those as two different sorts of coaching, if you like. The one that's involved around the process is, for a long time now, I mean, I was one of the first agile coaches here in the UK way back in the year 2003. God, that was some time ago. And I never used the word coach at that time. It's something that the industry started to use. I used to call myself a mentor. I'm a process mentor. I'm helping people to do the process because I've been there, done it, got the t-shirt, and I want to help people how to do it, how to do it even better. And then there's the other side, which is the coaching itself, helping people on the learning journey. And again, it's very interesting because when I'm brought in by other organizations, especially HR departments, to coach performance, as you just said, that can be seen as remedial, as in, you guys aren't good enough and we're going to have to try and fix you. So we're going to make you the broken cog in the wheel work, which is a very mechanistic and unhumanistic model, as opposed to developmental coaching. So look, yeah, from an agile perspective, we believe in continuous improvement. So therefore, you can always get better. You can always do better. So I'm wondering, is it one or either of those or both of those?
I think it's both of those. I think, again, because we were had a more internal coaching perspective, that so a couple of other things. I think the coaches, because they were internal and really knew a lot of the work and knew a lot of the players, even outside of IT, right? They knew their other business partners and stakeholders, had a unique vantage point from that perspective. I think they also, as they continued to grow and we were vetting out who the right people are in certain roles, they were able to, with the help of the external coaches, really interject stressors to get to, is this the right person that's in this role? So I think that's another important point. I think the other thing that's really important is that when we, with the internal folks, coaches, we allowed them to have a new identity. So we kind of gave them nicknames, and really, some of them maybe had been there with the company for 15 years. There was one that basically came maybe 3 years out of college, but had been there for 15 years. So who he was, and people that knew him still kind of, in their mind, knew him as this young man out of college, and now he's, a mature, professional. And it allowed him and others, but that was just an example, to really kind of shed all of that other, thoughts about who they were, or the perception from the company perspective of who they were, and really allowed them to have their own identity and really manifest itself and grow. And it was so really like beautiful to see that manifestation of almost every single person that was in that role, that really just how closely they all became with one another, and just how they changed and really were like helped one another, and it was just a very powerful collaboration between all of them, and genuine respect and admiration that was just wonderful to see. And quite honestly, I don't think I'll ever see it again. It was just a very unique experience and opportunity. It just there was just an ability for that to grow.
Yeah. So as I put different words around what you're saying there, Denise, we have an expression over here about the different hats that we wear, depending on the circumstances. So what I'm translating as you saying there is that there was the opportunity that this person would be in this role in his day to day, but as call him an agile coach, he then have his agile coach hat on. You gave him a nickname which would embody that. Look, while I'm wearing this cap, while I've got this nickname, I'm now engaging in this role, if you like, or these sets of responsibilities. Is that the sort of thing you're saying?
Yes, and I think it also allowed them to really also take what they've learned in terms of being open and asking questions and not seeking to understand rather than to defend, and all of the things that we kind of said. Look, what we did, just to kind of go back, what we did when we started the transformation is really have town hall meetings. And so communication was really important in terms of why we were going through this transformation. But we also kind of set up a guiding principles. And so in those guiding principles, we're really kind of, again, talking, having people understand that we want to change your thinking from vertical thinking to an enterprise thinking. So when you're doing something, when you're asking questions, when you're thinking about what you're going to do, how you're going to change something, it's no longer in your little world. How is that affecting everyone else downstream? Or how is that affecting the larger organization? Is there value in that? So, we kind of took and educated people too about, the associates about what we're doing and how we're changing things. We then, took that and also from an HR perspective, changed the way that we did recruiting. We changed our performance management. So our reviews, how we did reviews, what was important within the reviews, understanding that those, yes, your technical abilities was obviously very important. That should be almost a given that you can do that well, right? So that's your role. It should be. But how well are you thinking globally? How well are you thinking for the better good? Are you seeking to understand, or are you just trying to defend your own ideas? So those were really critical in once we again had the conversation with the associate base that these are the things that you're going to be judged, you're assessed upon. So it is in the review now. Gave them advanced copies of the review so that they knew what it was going to be, right? So that they can keep that in mind. So, I feel like I kind of got off on a little bit different path, but just in general, when you're talking about changing and working with, other business segments, they really all do kind of blend together, and you can't kind of just say it's just this, because it really works. And even if you were doing it from an HR perspective and just changing your practices, if you change that practice alone to the company, it now has ripple effects. So I just think that it's very hard to do a transformation in just one segment. It's done. I'm not saying that they don't do it, but it's almost, why bother?
We see, look, there's a number of things here that I chuck into the mix here. What do we mean by a transformation? Because I conform to a model, and again, we had some interesting conversations about this in the past, about, well, transformation, if it's defined as transforming the organization, needs to be done, I'd say in a systemic way. And my good friend Sai, who's here on the chat as well today, talks about the ecosystem and the idea that there's different aspects, and these all have to come together, to make the change happen. So I'm quite a believer that, look, unless you're working with the head of the organization, the leaders of the organization, that's when I would tend to say that you get the best form of transformation. And in fact, I think it's Anderson and Ackerman talk about, look, the only way transformation happens is when you work with that top level of the organization. anything else really isn't transformation. So hence, I think I've been called maybe a little dogmatic in the past when I say, well, look, it's not transformation unless. Well, okay, you're right, as you're saying, Denise. We can have some form of transformation in the different parts of the organization, but I tend to believe that involving the leadership as early as possible, in that transformation process, it just pays such big dividends.
Yeah. So I agree with you, Mark. I think that from an ideal world, right, you would have them right there next to you, championing it, going out on the floor and saying, this is what we're doing. In the real world, that probably doesn't happen. So I can tell you that when IT and HR started really working with one another, and because of the way that we were working, and the stakeholders and the business partners were involved, that it quickly became, for those, so like our chief marketing officer was like, wow, this is really great. So how can I start doing this, right? So it quickly took on a life of its own, and so that was good to see. You still really would like the C-suite or the CEO or the COO to really kind of, again, champion it. But I do think that you're able to, it's slower and it's harder, but I think that it can kind of take on a life of its own and have its own kind of, wave.
Well, you want to get the tipping point, don't you? You want to get it so that it has that momentum. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And again, I think that, my chief HR officer certainly was not involved. I was the face of that. So I really was, bringing him up to date on things, but I was not the one that was really able to champion completely, right? I mean, I went to him and said, this is what we need to do. And most of the times he would be like, fine, then just go do it. But I think that, there was times that it would have been nice for him, again, to be like right next to me doing it. There was, and I will give you an example of that. Again, I got his support, but I think it would have been a little bit different. So as we were going through the changing, how we went through talent acquisition, how we were sourcing our talent, and how we were interviewing our talent. So we really looked at one, who's interviewing people. What, should we use the old model? Obviously not. We changed our structure, our organizational structure. So who's interviewing? How are we interviewing? Is it a panel? Is it one-on-one? What's the candidate life cycle like, and journey life like? Keeping that in mind, we standardized some of the questions, not all of them, but some of them, to make sure that there was both behavioral and situational questions. We did a debrief after the candidate left. So everyone that was interviewing, what's your thoughts? Went around the room, did you get different sense? Again, if it was the same question that we asked, that everyone had on their sheet to ask, what was the response? Was it a consistent response? Was it not? Where did we see the red flags? Where did we see the cracks? We then would, once we had people, we would bring them back and do kind of more of a simulation, put them through what it's going to be like to be an architect or project manager, and see how they perform in that. We also, interestingly enough, uncovered that going through the simulations, because we would bring our own associates in, that some of those associates that maybe were in a lower level position actually had the skills that were kind of suppressed in the old structure, and they rose to the top. So it was just a very interesting way of now really looking at talent acquisition. I was met with a lot of resistance from my talent acquisition director.
Wow. Okay.
Yes, because she felt like I was stepping on her toes and trying to take over the process. And I wasn't. I wanted to be more inclusive and involve them, but she was very adamant that we do it the old way, and that just wasn't going to happen. And so I had to go to, my the chief HR officer and really kind of say, like, this is not working. So we ultimately went through and went it was difficult. It was hard. So again, I think that's just an example of how HR itself was very siloed, and how HR has to really change, and you have to bring in your sometimes your HR leader to set that tone.
Right, so there's a couple of things here, and I'm just mindful of the time because that's just done a half an hour now, and again, I want to talk for another hour. This is just so interesting as far as I'm concerned. So there's a number of things here, and if anybody's got any questions that they'd like to ask Denise, just put them up on the chat board here, and I'll fire them at her. But while we're talking about that one, the talent acquisition process, if I put, again, some different words around what you're saying, the old ways that you're talking about there, was that along the lines of the unstructured interview? The idea that you sit down and you just shoot the breeze with someone, and it's just like, oh yeah, and then leaders are very good at saying, yeah, I've got a gut feel, I'm a very good judge of character, and all of this stuff is all very unscientific, isn't it? Yeah, so hence the agile way is to say, actually, do you know what? We don't do things like that anymore. We want things that will actually help us to really drill into the person and help understand them. Because do you know what? There's a lot of biases that leaders have when they're in the interviewing process that they're not even aware of. But if we can hand that over and give them, like you say, some structured approach to the interviews, then that gives a way more rounded process that actually helps the organization as well as the individuals coming into it. Because how many times do we find that the individuals that we hire on our gut feel, we waste a lot of time and effort because they're not the right person at all?
Absolutely. So I think that yes, the way that it was structured was really just that kind of sourced the candidate, had the phone screen, they came in, HR got that, okay, they're going to fit in the culture and organization, and talk about that, and then we would pass them on to whatever business segment that was, whether it's marketing or finance, and they would really ask the more technical questions. Again, I think that as HR changes and needs to change and has a seat at the table, HR's responsibility is to, before you pass that candidate on or bring them in, is that HR needs to really understand what that role is. What are the core competencies within that role, and vet that person out before that person ever gets into the door. And yes, listen, I'm not going to be able to speak to, we had architects in as one of the areas that I supported. I'm not going to be able to get into what kind of elevations you work with and all of the different architectural firms or terms, but I'm going to ask based upon what we need, whether you're qualified or not. I shouldn't be wasting someone's time. That's my job and responsibility, right, as an HR professional within the talent acquisition team, to vet that out. So I think that is one thing. I think the other thing is that you need to really start using metrics, and I don't think HR is particularly savvy when it comes to using metrics. It's always been really much more of that human dynamic and area. So I think that you need to do that. I think that you can start also by bringing in agile within HR. Using a sprint when you're talking about what are the open positions, using your Kanban board, what's the backlog, why, what's the impediments. You can really start using that and really shorten the recruiting time and do it in by building those metrics. What makes someone, a successful hire? That all takes time because you have to build that data. And I think that's important because some people want, quick, like, oh, it's supposed to be agile. I'm supposed to know tomorrow, like, what it is. No, that's not what that means. So I think, but if you do that and you build your data to understand 6 months from now, who are the people that are successful, and not just within, again, this goes back to HR, not just within, finance or IT, but across the board. Yes, it's important to understand and drill down, but what's making someone successful within that organization? What soft skills maybe does everyone have in common that we see? What's that common thread? And how can we then hire against those? So I think that's really important as well.
So this comes back to something you said earlier, and then I've got a question to ask you because what's up on the board here. This idea of HR being the stewards of the culture. It's like, look, this is our job. They don't get past us until we know that there's a fit, that there's a match, that the values are aligned. And again, I was hired by a consultancy, some years ago, and it fast became apparent that the words that they used in the interview to attract me to come and work with them were just that. They were just words. The values didn't land because those values weren't honored. And I talk about this whole aspect of collaboration. They weren't a collaborative organization. They were very siloed. And the psychology department wanted to run tests on people, and anyone that had a questionnaire, well, I had to go through them, and they weren't very happy with us people in the IT department going out and assessing people because that was their job, which all gets rather silly. But anyway, so the whole stewards of the culture, I love that, and it's been commented here earlier that's an excellent expression. So the question here that we've got is from a HR perspective then, what are the top 3 things I should be aware of or to keep in mind that will help me to be successful? We'll start with what?
I think one of the things that you need to be aware of is, again, it's how you're changing what the practices and how you're doing that. I think experimentation is key, meaning that you can try something, and if that's not working, that's not set in stone. Go back and this is another thing. I think that in the past, HR has always been like, oh, you have to go to HR. They know how to deal with whatever problem it is, as it relates to a human relation issue. And sometimes we don't, sometimes we don't know. We don't have all, you're dealing with a human being. We don't have all of the answers. And I think that changing and working and being involved in a transformation is saying, we don't have all of the answers, but let's try something. And if it's not working, let's understand why it's not working. Is it not just working for you because you don't like it? You have to always, manage that. So kind of that experimentation. I think the other thing is that,
as well.
And yes.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that's really key is, and I hear this all the time, is about, bringing human dignity to the workplace, where we kind of lost some of that humanity. And I think that it's really important to understand that, when you talk about that, you have to talk about it in context of the workplace, meaning that there's going to be really, really difficult decisions that need to be made. There's going to be people that you're going to have really difficult conversations with, whether that is ultimately you're not the right person for the organization, you're not the right person for this role, and what does that mean? And you know what, we think that you add value, but just not in this role. Well, then, what does that mean from a salary perspective and compensation perspective? What does that mean, right? So those are all very, very difficult conversations that you're going to have. And I think that I'll go back to what I had talked about, having the courage. I think that awareness and having that courage is key. I think that when you're going through that, you have to be ready to also lose some good people. I think you have to, look at and understand, and you can try to mitigate that risk as much as you can. But depending upon how quickly the transformation is taking place, what the noise is around that transformation, how quickly you are addressing that noise around that transformation, is going to be key, because people are going to, the really good people are going to kind of have that refreshment, right? Like, wow, this is a great way of working. And if it doesn't take hold, or it takes hold too quickly, they're out, they're gone. They're like, I saw the light and it's not here anymore. I'm gone. So I think that that's really important as well. So I would say just be mindful to how quickly you react to certain.
See, that to me is so important, because so often I come across leaders who will talk a good talk, but they don't walk the walk. And when it comes to walking that walk, I don't find them very compassionate. And because this idea now that the dignity in the workplace, so important. You can't keep treating people like they're automatons. And as I was saying earlier, this idea of getting a coach in to fix people, that's a very mechanistic view of the world. And it hurts people. So I'm always asked the questions, by leaders who say, well, look, are we going to have any fallouts as a result of this transformation? Will we have people leaving us? Absolutely you will, because agile ways of working don't suit everyone. But when you come to that position, that you actually have that difficult and uncomfortable conversation, you have to do that with compassion, and understanding that, these are human beings you're dealing with. So to deal with them in a compassionate way and in a loving way, that's a bit touchy-feely. And sometimes IT leaders don't want to hear that sort of talk. And it's, well, you know what you're talking about, Mark. Let's just get them out of the organization and let's move on. It's like, right, okay, if that's the way you work here, that's fine. But you know what? I'm probably not the person for you in your organization now, because I won't have you treat people like that. And if that is your way of treating people, then that's absolutely wrong.
I agree. And I think you also have to realize that, this is a change that people are going through, and it's always difficult. And I'd like to just give the audience one example. So we moved from, giving feedback in what traditionally was a one-on-one in an office, usually in my office or a manager's office. And then when we started going to, workforce work opens and closes, we would give feedback in a much larger setting, sometimes with other business segments there, because they were from the teams. And, I could see when people were giving feedback that associates were uncomfortable. I mean, you're in this room with maybe 25, 50 people, right? And now you're singling me out and giving me feedback, and it's uncomfortable. I would be in the room, which hence back to HR's connectivity. And when we first started doing it, as I saw that people on their face were so uncomfortable, my first reaction was to shut the conversation down. Like, this is not going to work. And I had to take a step back and be like, no, you can't, but you can be here to make sure that it's done in a constructive, positive way.
Yes.
And that was a difficult learning for me as an HR professional who has done it that way for 20 plus years, to really take that step back. And I think that it was really important, and I'm glad that I had to go through that and feel that uncomfortableness myself, because now I understood what everyone else was going through. So I think that that's really important. You yourself are going to have to go through a personal transformation and change yourself. And I think that that is key. Most people think, oh, it's the business, it's the company. Well, who makes up the company? It's you. It's you. You are going to have to change and make that change. So I think that that's really key and important as well.
So look, Denise, I think that is a wonderful place to lead this conversation. And I just want to take a moment just to thank you so much. I mean, I have so appreciated this conversation. I've appreciated you and your openness and helping to, help people to understand. And that last point, this idea that you have to be the change, it's one of the most misquoted Gandhi quotes. That be the change. Gandhi never said that, but that's okay. Yeah, but I think it's important to understand that. Yeah, that look, be the change, because that's where transformation happens. And people see that. If people see the leaders changing, they start to go, oh, wow, they're being different. And when that coaching really takes hold, it really does help. And when you see that compassionate self, the humble self coming forward, the higher self, you might call it,
Yeah.
great things happen. But we don't.
And I think it's important too, that when we were going through the teams that really respected one another and gave each other feedback, both were able to give it and receive it. Those were the teams that thrived. Those were the teams that were so successful.
Yeah.
And again, it was sometimes very difficult conversations and points that they were talking about, but they did it in a way that, hey, you know what? I know, Mark, you're going to tell me something, and it's to better me, right? It's not being done in a just for criticizing me. It's to help me get better, right? To elevate my game. And the teams that were really healthy, they thrived on that, and the teams that were not healthy, even with my guidance and other coaches' guidance, they just, they were just never going to get it. And really kind of, again, goes back to having those difficult decisions to make as to, are they the right people in the roles or for the organization?
Yeah, well, if you don't have those conversations or don't have them, you'll stay stuck where you always have been. In which case there will be no transformation.
Correct. So thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I really enjoyed talking to you as we have in the past.
Brilliant.
So thank you so much.
Yeah, and what I'll do is I'll make sure I get this recording out to you, and that'll be good. Awesome. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark.
Take care now.